The emperor gazed at Charles King with a face full of concern, his worry evident without the need for words. "Your son is feeling much better," Charles replied, though he coughed a few more times after speaking. The emperor nodded in concern, signaling him to take a seat. Eleanor Bennet observed Charles King today. He seemed even more fragile than before. If she hadn't witnessed his cold, murderous demeanor before, she might have been deceived by his current weak appearance. "Eunuch Liam, let us begin." The emperor glanced at Eleanor Bennet, his eyes full of admiration. Receiving the order, Eleanor stepped out from the small chamber, clapping her hands crisply. At that moment, music began to play, and the dancers gracefully entered. Holding chrysanthemum lanterns in their hands, they moved with elegance, resembling celestial beings descending from the heavens. The melody of "Chrysanthemum Terrace" captivated everyone's ears. Standing on the jade steps, Eleanor Bennet listened to the tune played on ancient zither and pipas. Though lacking modern elements, it carried a unique charm. Eleanor Bennet returned inside from the side of the floral hall but caught sight of Charles King's cold gaze, accompanied by a faint, chilling smile. Startled, she quickly hid behind a screen. However, when she peeked again, his face had reverted to its earlier frail appearance. "Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet." Lily Traynor softly called her, noticing her lost in thought. "Lily Traynor, my dear sister." Eleanor Bennet realized her lapse in manners and smiled awkwardly. "These chrysanthemums are ready. Do we need to prepare anything else?" Lily Traynor brought out the washed chrysanthemums. "Place the chrysanthemums together with the snow mist tea for brewing, and that's all." Eleanor Bennet dropped a chrysanthemum petal into a teacup and poured in the pre-prepared snow mist tea. She and Lily Traynor then served the tea. "Your Majesty, this is my first time tasting such a unique tea." Concubine Florence sipped delicately, her smile radiant like moonlit flowers. Indeed, the gentle sweetness of the chrysanthemum offsets the bitterness of the snow mist, yet it accentuates its pure fragrance. Truly one of a kind. Alexander King couldn't help but take another sip. "Eleanor Bennet, what is the name of this tea?" Alexander King asked joyfully, looking at her. "Replying to your Majesty, this humble servant has temporarily named it Chrysanthemum Noir." "A beautiful name, Chrysanthemum Noir, this tea is very much to my liking." "Eleanor Bennet, I wish to reward you generously," Alexander King said with satisfaction. "Your Majesty, I humbly thank you for your grace, but Eleanor Bennet dares not take credit alone, as this is all the result of teamwork with Luke T., she replied, fully aware of the principle that the leader often becomes the target. "All right, then the 6 departments will be rewarded with 3 months' salary according to their ranks." As Alexander King spoke, all the attendants knelt down in gratitude. At this moment, Eleanor Bennet, standing behind Eunuch Liam, whispered a few words before stepping back. "Your Majesty, please step outside." Eunuch Liam said with a mysterious smile. "Oh. Is there another surprise?" Alexander King stood up, leading concubine Florence outside. The princes followed in succession, each curious about what other delights awaited them. Standing on the balcony, Alexander King listened as music began to play. With a few loud booms, fireworks burst forth like celestial maidens scattering flowers, illuminating the sky like a flowing river of light. The vibrant colors appeared and disappeared like fleeting hibiscus blooms. Then came more booms, with fireworks resembling golden chrysanthemums in full bloom, peonies showing off their colors, sometimes like colorful butterflies fluttering, great dragons soaring, other times like radiant fire trees, wild rainbows. The night sky was adorned in a dazzling array, the ground below as bright as day. "Your Majesty, it's truly beautiful." Concubine Florence exclaimed joyfully, leaning beside Alexander King. Eleanor Bennet stood in a hidden corner, watching everyone immersed in the night's beauty, unable to help but reflect. The world's splendor is akin to these magnificent fireworks. After their brilliance, where will they go? Ah! Taking advantage of Eleanor Bennet's momentary distraction, someone covered her mouth from behind. "Come with me." She heard a man's voice, and when she looked up, she met his cold gaze. Before she could resist, she was led away from the floral hall. "Your Highness, what are you doing?" Eleanor Bennet broke free from his grasp, her face flushed with anger. "Tell me, what is your purpose?" She sensed the hostility from him once more. "I don't understand your meaning." Despite a hint of fear, Eleanor Bennet tried to maintain her composure. "What is the purpose of Arthur Bennet sending you to the palace?" Charles King moved closer to her, his eyes icy. "So, you are also scheming for the position of Crown Prince." Eleanor Bennet, seeing through his intent, felt oddly relieved. "How ridiculous, if I wanted it, why would I need to scheme?" Charles King looked at her with disdain. "If not, then why feign illness?" Seeing him now, Eleanor Bennet was even more certain that his weakness was just a facade for others to see. Women, being too clever isn't a good thing. Charles King suddenly tightened his grip around her neck, causing her face to redden from lack of air. "What, did I hit a nerve, and now you want to silence me?" Eleanor Bennet gasped, but had no intention of pleading, for he was never a man of honor. Charles King let go of Eleanor Bennet, and she clutched her neck, gasping for breath. "I have no interest in your struggles for the throne, nor do I wish to become a pawn of Arthur Bennet. I only want to live peacefully here for 3 years and then leave this place of turmoil. Whether you believe me or not, you don't need to worry that I'll expose you." Eleanor Bennet expressed her intentions clearly, merely hoping not to become a sacrifice in political schemes. "I only believe that the dead can keep secrets," Charles King said, leaning slightly. The moonlight illuminated his figure, exuding an ethereal aura. "Now you can take my life." Eleanor Bennet stood resolutely before him, showing no fear. Charles King was momentarily taken aback. It was the first time he had seen someone face death with such calmness. And that person was a woman. She was truly remarkable, sparking his curiosity to learn more about her. Charles King turned away and disappeared into the night like water. Eleanor Bennet sighed with relief, wondering if she had just escaped a calamity. She placed her hand on her wildly beating heart, knowing she was gambling, putting herself in danger to find a way to survive. She couldn't understand why Charles King feigned illness. Considering the Emperor's concern today, he was surely the Emperor's most beloved son. If he wanted to become the Crown Prince, why engage in such unnecessary actions? Moreover, there was a genuine cold aura about him. If not illness, then how could it be explained? What did this mysterious man truly want? Eleanor Bennet's mind was filled with questions, and though she didn't want to get involved, she seemed to have been caught in this relentless whirlpool. To escape her destined fate, she needed a greater support, and that support was the Emperor. If she devoted herself to playing the role of a tea-serving maid, living peacefully for 3 years shouldn't be difficult. Eleanor Bennet didn't go to the flower hall but returned to her room. Perhaps by now, the other side had also dispersed. Lily Traynor brought Eleanor Bennet the dessert bestowed by the Emperor, but found her sitting in a daze, looking quite strange. "Eleanor Bennet, I didn't see you during the fireworks." "So you were here." Lily Traynor set down the food box, noticing Eleanor Bennet's dreamy expression. "Huh? What?" Eleanor Bennet looked up at Lily Traynor, having completely missed her question. "Today, His Majesty was in a great mood and rewarded us with many gifts. Aren't you going to take a look?" Lily Traynor cheerfully sat next to Eleanor Bennet. "No, I'm a bit tired." "If you like those things, you can have them." Eleanor Bennet forced a smile. "Eleanor Bennet, at this rate, the position of chief attendant will surely be yours. I've only recently entered the palace and wouldn't dare to have such lofty thoughts. I'm just doing my duty. You may not think so, but that doesn't mean others don't. Today, you've stood out in front of His Majesty. I'm afraid chief attendantly, the managers of the 6 departments, and the ladies in the other palaces will all keep an eye on you. Lily Traynor spoke candidly, making Eleanor Bennet realize something she hadn't considered. She only thought of using the Emperor's favor to protect herself, forgetting the intrigues of the inner palace. It seemed her days ahead would be anything but peaceful. "Thank you, sister, for the reminder." Eleanor Bennet quickly bowed in gratitude. "I was just mentioning it casually. You should rest early." Lily Traynor smiled and left. Eleanor Bennet realized that tonight, Lily had come specifically to warn her. In the palace, everyone looked out for themselves, and for Lily Traynor to be close to the Emperor, she was certainly no ordinary person. Eleanor Bennet lay in bed, tossing and turning with worry for another sleepless night. Chapter 15, Schemes inside the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. Sandalwood incense wafted through the emerald silk curtains. On a gilded red lacquered desk lay several rolls of silk paper and various paints. Edward King focused on painting, his brush strokes flowing like clouds and water, gradually bringing to life the image of a maiden with elegant brows and a face as beautiful as a flower. "Third brother, this is quite intriguing." Edward King lifted his head and saw Edward King and Richard King standing before the desk. The two were staring intently at the painting on the desk, seemingly recognizing the person in the portrait. "You two arrived at just the right time. I recently received some silver bamboo, let's enjoy it together." Edward King set down his brush, and the three of them walked out to the main hall outside. "Third brother, the person in this painting looks so familiar." Richard King glanced back at the painting on the desk one last time, reluctant to leave, before finally stepping out. "Fifth brother, your eyesight is really lacking." Edward King leaned against the chaise lounge, chuckling softly. "Fourth brother, if you know, then just tell me already," Richard King said, growing impatient. Edward King, seated at the chief position, merely smiled as he sipped his tea. "Isn't she the beauty from Father Emperor's palace?" Edward King looked at Edward King, his expression slightly puzzled. "Oh, so it's her." Richard King recalled Eleanor Bennet, who had been incredibly striking during the Lantern Festival. It truly did resemble her. Could it be that this Eleanor Bennet is the one third brother has been searching for all along? Edward King said while fiddling with the jade pendant at his waist, his demeanor calm and composed. "Fourth brother, I don't understand what you're saying." Richard King looked utterly confused. "It's her." A flicker of tenderness appeared in Edward King's eyes. "If it's her, why hasn't third brother brought her back to his own palace?" Edward King asked, somewhat perplexed. It seemed he already knew she was one of the palace maidens selected this time. "I've made arrangements, but I didn't expect Cloudveiled Palace to interfere. That Chief Eunuch Lee is known for his tactfulness and prefers not to offend anyone, so sending her to Father Emperor's palace was the safest choice." A flash of resentment appeared in Edward King's eyes. "Cloudveiled Palace? Princess Joan Ting is currently with the Empress Dowager at Mount Cloud Top for a blessing, she's not in the palace at all." Edward King seemed to realize that the situation was not simple. It appeared that Eleanor Bennet was indeed a difficult character to deal with. "Yes, I also find this strange." Edward King frowned, wondering if she had another purpose for entering the palace. Could it be Arthur Bennet? Edward King voiced his thoughts. No matter how formidable Arthur Bennet is, he can't interfere in the affairs of the inner palace. Edward King believed it wasn't the Bennet family behind this. "Oh, you two are really troublesome. It's just a woman. If third brother likes her, he can simply ask father to issue an order." Richard King grew impatient as their conversation became more complex. "Fifth brother is indeed straightforward." Edward King laughed. "Fifth brother, if she were an ordinary person, it would be as you said, but now it's quite difficult." Edward King's eyes gleamed with cunning. "Fifth brother, you really should learn more from fourth brother." Edward King understood the implication in Edward King's words. Currently, she was highly valued and trusted by the emperor, and keeping her around would require considerable effort. Third brother, Arthur Bennet's attitude is very ambiguous right now, and as for Eleanor Bennet, don't pay too much attention to her, or you might be manipulated by her. Edward King knew that Edward King wasn't one to be swayed by women, but when it came to Eleanor Bennet, he seemed a bit unsettled. Fourth brother, rest assured, I know my limits. Edward King replied coolly. Until Arthur Bennet's position was clear, he truly couldn't get too close to Eleanor Bennet. Third brother, the person who went to Camden Province has returned. Noticing Edward King's cold expression, Richard King realized he might have said too much. Edward King had always been the one he trusted the most. Oh. Any progress? Edward King asked. All the evidence points to the Crown Prince. Richard King replied. And what about the Duke of Stirling? A trace of disappointment flickered in Edward King's eyes. That old fox seems to have caught wind of something, he didn't leave a single clue. Richard King responded. Chris Carter would never let us catch him so easily. Edward King had anticipated this outcome. Third brother, if the Crown Prince falls out of favor, is it possible the Duke of Stirling will turn to support the ninth prince, Simon? Richard King asked anxiously. I don't think so, Edward King replied calmly. Fourth brother, years ago, when concubine Violet passed away, it was the Empress Dowager who orchestrated it. The Duke of Stirling would never side with the Crown Prince. The most likely scenario is that he will support the ninth prince. Richard King brought up the past, unaware that Edward King's face had grown darker. Edward King remained silent, knowing that his brother had inadvertently touched a deep wound. Old Five, stop talking. Edward King quickly signaled Richard King to be silent. Edward King raised his hand, rubbing his temples, recalling the tragic scene of his mother's past, feeling a tightness in his chest. Despite the passing of many years, they still hadn't been able to overthrow the Carter family. Fourth brother, prepare a petition to accuse David King. Edward King slammed his hand on the table, his eyes filled with resentment. I understand. Edward King stood up, pulling Richard King, who was standing beside him, away from the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. Eleanor Bennet was making tea in the Hall of Heavenly Purity when she heard a commotion outside. She stepped out to see Alexander King storming in angrily, followed by Edward King, Richard King, and David King. Eleanor Bennet quickly knelt down, noticing David King's slightly unsteady steps. Could it be that Edward King had already acted against him? Eleanor Bennet retreated inside, bringing out the prepared tea tray and placing it on the small table next to the master's. As she passed by Richard King, she unexpectedly saw him giving her a mischievous smile. Eleanor Bennet was a bit flustered and stepped back. She recognized Richard King as someone with a carefree personality, but his strange expression today left her puzzled. Humph, rebellious child, you've disgraced the royal family. Alexander King angrily threw a petition at David King. Father, please forgive me, I am wronged. David King trembled, kneeling on the ground to plead. Eleanor Bennet glanced at Edward King and Richard King sitting calmly beside him, suddenly understanding everything. Crime. The acts you've committed in Kamjo, I could have you executed 10 times over. Alexander King shouted at David King. Father, I was momentarily foolish. David King knew he couldn't escape and continuously kowtowed, begging for mercy. Eleanor Bennet looked at David King kneeling on the ground with disdain. Indeed, as Arthur Bennet had said, this man could achieve nothing significant. Third brother, imprison this traitor in the royal prison, awaiting judgment. Without my decree, no one is allowed to visit. Edward King received the order, and the guards escorted David King out of the main hall. Fourth brother, you are responsible for investigating this case. Anyone involved, regardless of their rank, once confirmed, shall be thrown into the dungeon. Alexander King issued strict orders, making Eleanor Bennet wonder what exactly happened in Kamjo to anger the emperor so greatly. "Everyone, leave. I need some peace." Alexander King wearily leaned on the table, signaling everyone to depart. Eunuch Liam stepped forward to support the emperor and signaled the attendants to leave. "Eleanor Bennet, stay and serve me." Alexander King ordered Eleanor Bennet, who was behind the screen. "As you command, Your Majesty." When Edward King left, his meaningful glance made Eleanor Bennet uneasy. Though he appeared gentle, he was likely deeply cunning and strategic. "Your Majesty, shall I help you to the bed for a rest?" Eleanor Bennet assisted Alexander King to the royal bed. Eunuch Liam gave Eleanor Bennet a cautious look before quietly leaving. "Your Majesty, I have just brewed a new type of tea. Would you like to try it?" Eleanor Bennet asked carefully, seeing that Alexander King was still not calmed down. Eleanor Bennet noticed Alexander King's subtle agreement and brought tea to him. This tea has such a delicate flavor." Alexander King took a sip, seemingly calming down. "Raising a daughter like you, Arthur Bennet, is indeed very fortunate," Alexander King remarked. "His Majesty's children are all exceptional, bearing the welfare of the people. My father would not dare to compare with His Majesty." Eleanor Bennet replied skillfully, making Alexander King smile. "If they truly cared for the people, I could be at ease." A hint of regret flashed across Alexander King's face. "I am not knowledgeable about worldly matters, but I believe if a ruler governs with virtue, peace will prevail." Eleanor Bennet responded gently. Alexander King leaned back in his chair, looking at Eleanor Bennet in amazement at her understanding of royal principles at such a young age. "Your Majesty, Lady Consort Jung requests an audience outside the palace." Eunuch Liam reported cautiously. "I won't see her. Tell her to return to her quarters." Alexander King replied irritably. "Your Majesty, Lady Consort Jung said if you do not meet her, she will kneel outside the hall indefinitely." Eunuch Liam appeared troubled. "If she wants to kneel, let her kneel." Alexander King was slightly angry. "Your servant obeys." Eunuch Liam hurriedly withdrew. Eleanor Bennet had heard from Lily Traynor that Lady Jungfei was the mother of the Crown Prince David King, daughter of the Duke of Dinghua, and granddaughter of the Empress Dowager. Her status in the palace was undoubtedly significant. However, Eleanor Bennet felt that she was not a wise woman. Choosing this moment to plead for David King might not only fail to achieve her desire but also increase the king's displeasure. "Your Majesty, shall I fetch a silk blanket for you to rest?" Eleanor Bennet assisted Alexander King in lying down, covered him with a silk blanket, and then stepped outside to await further instructions. Chapter 16, Blossoming Fragrance. "Your Grace, please return to the palace first." Eunuch Liam advised Consort Jung, who was kneeling on the ground outside the hall. "Today, I must meet His Majesty." Consort Jung, known for her stubbornness in the palace, often relied on her status as a relative of the Empress Dowager to act arrogantly. "Your Grace, His Majesty is angry right now. Why must you insist on this?" "Eunuch Liam, tell me, who is currently attending to His Majesty in the Hall of Heavenly Purity?" Consort Jung suddenly noticed that all the servants attending to the emperor were outside, including Eunuch Liam. Eunuch Liam hesitated, unsure how to respond, and dared not offend Consort Jung. Consort Jung stood up and headed into the hall. "Your Grace, please don't make it difficult for this old servant." Eunuch Liam hurriedly stepped forward to stop her. Consort Jung was now convinced that the emperor's refusal to see her must be due to someone meddling. "Is that fox concubine Florence inside?" Consort Jung's eyes burned with hatred and jealousy. "It's not concubine Florence, Your Grace." Eunuch Liam quickly explained. Consort Jung ignored him and stormed straight into the hall. "Your Grace, truly, there's no one inside, only the palace maid Eleanor Bennet serving tea." Eunuch Liam, out of options, had to clarify. So, it's her. Consort Jung had heard of Eleanor Bennet, who, despite being a mere palace maid, had quickly gained the emperor's favor and received numerous rewards. Her rising influence seemed to overshadow even her superiors. Filled with rage, she strode into the hall. Eleanor Bennet, seeing the imposing consort Jung dressed magnificently and entering with an air of dominance, immediately knelt down to pay her respects. You must be Eleanor Bennet. Consort Jung glared at Eleanor Bennet with disdainful eyes. This servant is indeed Eleanor Bennet, Eleanor Bennet responded with her head bowed. Humph. Another sly fox. A harsh slap landed on Eleanor Bennet's face, sending her to the ground as her cheek burned with pain. Who dares to cause such a commotion out there? Hearing the noise, Alexander King irritably sat up, only to see Consort Jung standing smugly with arrogance. Consort Jung, how bold of you! You even dare to defy my imperial decree. Alexander King roared in anger, forcing Consort Jung to hurriedly kneel. Your Majesty, I only acted out of concern for David's situation. Please grant me mercy. Consort Jung pleaded tearfully. Do you still have any regard for me or the laws of the kingdom? Alexander King bellowed furiously. I acknowledge my guilt, Your Majesty. But David, though he may be arrogant at times, would never commit such heinous acts as embezzling relief funds or assassinating an imperial envoy. He must have been framed. I beg Your Majesty to investigate thoroughly. Consort Jung hastily defended David King, unaware that she herself was in grave peril. Eleanor Bennet finally understood why the emperor was so enraged over the events in Guangzhou. Get out. I don't want to see you again. Take her away. Alexander King commanded sharply, but as soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed to the ground. Seeing this, Eleanor Bennet quickly rushed over to check his pulse. Eunuch Liam, panicked at the sight of the emperor fainting, immediately ordered someone to summon the imperial physician. Meanwhile, the guards dragged Consort Jung out. Chaos erupted both inside and outside the Hall of Heavenly Purity. Eleanor Bennet swiftly diagnosed that Alexander King had suffered a stroke. Lily Traynor, sister, quickly go to my room and fetch the white needle pouch from the wardrobe. Eleanor Bennet laid Alexander King flat on the ground and checked his pupils. Startled into action, Lily Traynor didn't pause to ask questions and hurried off. Eleanor Bennet, what are you doing? Why aren't you helping His Majesty onto the bed? Eunuch Liam, confused by Eleanor Bennet's unusual actions, shouted angrily. Eunuch Liam, do not move His Majesty under any circumstances right now. He has suffered a stroke. His life is hanging by a thread. Eleanor Bennet explained. Seeing Lily Traynor holding a bag of needles, she quickly stepped forward, grabbed it, and began performing acupuncture on Alexander King. Medical practices in Britain were very outdated, and almost none of the imperial physicians at the Imperial Medical Institute understood acupuncture. Even Eunuch Liam had only witnessed Daniel Moore perform acupuncture on the ninth prince. He only knew that this technique was miraculous, and now, to his surprise, Eleanor Bennet also knew how to use it. Eleanor Bennet, stop acting recklessly. If anything goes wrong, your entire Bennet family will bear the blame. Eunuch Liam hurriedly tried to intervene. Eunuch Liam, rest assured, I wouldn't dare act carelessly without confidence. Eleanor Bennet responded confidently. Ignoring him, she began to insert the needles. Eunuch Liam stood nearby, anxiously watching. Eleanor Bennet, each needle prick making him hold his breath. At that moment, several imperial physicians from the Imperial Medical Institute arrived. Seeing the scene before them, they were all stunned. You insolent girl! The emperor is of noble blood, how dare you use such a risky acupuncture technique? Stop at once, the leading physician shouted. Eleanor Bennet ignored him and continued her treatment. Eunuch Liam, why haven't you stopped her yet? If anything happens to His Majesty, you won't escape blame either, the physician pressed eunuch Liam. Eleanor Bennet, seeing that Alexander King's condition had improved, breathed a sigh of relief. She inserted the final needle into the philtrum acupoint, and Alexander King gradually regained consciousness. The imperial physicians, who had earlier displayed arrogance, quickly changed their demeanor. "Your Majesty, how are you feeling?" Eleanor Bennet removed the silver needles from Alexander King and carefully checked his pulse. "You saved me." Alexander King looked at Eleanor Bennet in disbelief. It was she who had brought him back from the brink. "Your Majesty, have you forgotten? I once mentioned that I know a little about medicine." Eleanor Bennet replied with a playful smile, easing the tense atmosphere. "Your Majesty, you almost scared this old servant to death." "Thank goodness for Miss Eleanor Bennet." "Eunuch Liam, help His Majesty lie back on the bed." Eunuch Liam quickly ordered the attendants to assist. Eleanor Bennet swiftly wrote a prescription and handed it to the imperial physician who had been the loudest earlier. "Please prepare this medicine quickly," Eleanor Bennet said respectfully. The old man glanced at Eleanor Bennet with disdain, initially unwilling to take the prescription. "Follow Eleanor Bennet's instructions at once, you useless fools." Alexander King commanded sternly from his bed, his expression authoritative. "Yes, Your Majesty." The group, terrified, hastily accepted the prescription and retreated to fulfill the order. "Eleanor Bennet, where did you learn such advanced medical skills?" Alexander King asked curiously, still puzzled. "Your Majesty, I'm not quite sure where to begin." Eleanor Bennet hesitated, pondering how to explain, as it was indeed unusual for a sheltered young lady of the Bennet family to possess such medical knowledge. "Then start from the beginning." Alexander King seemed genuinely interested. "Your Majesty, before entering the palace, this servant once fell into the water and lost consciousness. It seemed as though, in a dream, I encountered an old man with white hair holding a medicine bottle. He gave me a pill to take. When I woke up, I couldn't remember anything from before. However, strangely enough, I suddenly possessed knowledge of medical skills." Eleanor Bennet fabricated a mythical story. She had once read Brin's medical books, where they also revered Shen Nong as the king of medicine. Creating such a tale would likely be easily accepted by these ancient people who deeply worshipped deities. "Your Majesty, this old servant had also heard before about Miss Bennet's family incident when she fell into the water. At that time, the palace even sent imperial physicians to treat her," Liam, the eunuch standing nearby, reported. "Well, if it's taught by a divine being, having such proficient medical skills isn't surprising." Alexander King seemed to believe Eleanor Bennet's words, allowing her to breathe a sigh of relief. She couldn't help but reflect on how living in the palace was truly challenging. "Eleanor Bennet, why is it that half of my body has no sensation? The Emperor wanted to move but couldn't." "Your Majesty has suffered a stroke, causing half of your body to lose sensation," Eleanor Bennet explained. "How long until I recover?" Alexander King asked worriedly. "As long as I perform acupuncture daily, you should recover in just over 2 weeks," Eleanor Bennet confidently replied. "Li Gongdong," announced the decree. Eleanor Bennet, with her intelligence, talent, and exceptional medical skills, is a talent that cannot be overlooked. From today, she is appointed as a medical scholar, a 6th-rank official, managing the Imperial Medical Institute. The decree was issued, leaving everyone astonished. "Your Majesty, our dynasty has never had a female official," Li Gongdong cautiously noted. "If there hasn't been one, then we start with this dynasty. I trust Eleanor Bennet can fulfill the role." Alexander King praised as he looked at Eleanor Bennet. "I thank your Majesty for your grace." Eleanor Bennet bowed in gratitude. In just one night, the news of Eleanor Bennet managing the Imperial Medical Institute spread throughout the palace. The rumors were rampant, claiming she was the incarnation of the Medicine King, unbelievably miraculous. As the first female official in Brin's history, wearing her official robes and standing on the palace's high towers, Eleanor Bennet was amazed at Alexander King's courage to break Britain's tradition by making her the first female official. She felt immense pressure, and her plan to leave the palace after 3 years seemed increasingly difficult. At present, she only felt the unpredictability of life, and the future appeared uncertain. Chapter 17, Coronation. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the Hall of Heavenly Purity to perform acupuncture on Alexander King and encountered Eunuch Liam serving outside the hall. Eunuch Liam. Eleanor Bennet greeted as she had before. Master Bennet, such courtesy. Eunuch Liam politely returned the greeting. Please just call me Eleanor Bennet. Although I no longer serve at the Hall of Heavenly Purity, I always remember your kindness from before. Eleanor Bennet said sincerely. Miss Bennet, you are truly talented, it's only natural that His Majesty appreciates you. Eunuch Liam replied with a smile. Could you please inform His Majesty of my arrival? Eleanor Bennet said with a smile. All right, I'll go right away. Please wait a moment, sir. Eunuch Liam stepped into the hall. A moment later, Eunuch Liam came back out. Sir Bennet, His Majesty has summoned you. Eunuch Liam announced. Thank you, Eunuch. Eleanor Bennet followed him into the grand hall. Upon entering the inner chamber, she saw Edward King and Edward King standing near the imperial bed. Dressed in official attire, with her feminine ornaments removed, Eleanor Bennet appeared even more striking. Both Edward King and Edward King gazed at her in astonishment. Your Majesty, this humble servant greets you. Eleanor Bennet ignored the gazes around her and knelt to pay her respects. Eleanor Bennet, I notice today that my fingers have started to move slightly. Alexander King's face lit up with joy upon seeing Eleanor Bennet. She quickly stepped forward to examine him carefully. Your Majesty has indeed recovered remarkably well. Today, I will perform acupuncture and massage therapy for you. Perhaps it won't be long before you can get out of bed and walk again. Eleanor Bennet took out her acupuncture needles and began the treatment. Third son, how is the investigation in Camden Province progressing? The Emperor looked toward Edward King, who was standing in the distance, and asked. Father. At that moment, Edward King's attention was entirely focused on Eleanor Bennet, making him miss the Emperor's question. Reporting to Father, all officials involved in the case have been imprisoned in the heavenly prison, awaiting Your Majesty's judgment. Edward King quickly stepped in to respond on behalf of Edward King. Eleanor Bennet glanced up at Edward King, who appeared distracted, and their eyes accidentally met. His gaze was tender and soft, causing her to quickly look away. Fortunately, Alexander King was engrossed in the matter of Camden Province and didn't notice anything unusual. Has that rebellious son confessed yet? Alexander King's anger flared as he thought of David King. Not yet, Father. Eldest brother continues to proclaim his innocence, Edward King replied. As a prince, you commit such a heinous act and still plead innocence. Rebellious son, rebellious son. Alexander King was extremely agitated, his breath becoming rapid. Your Majesty, please calm down. Eleanor Bennet hurriedly advised. Father, please calm down, your health is important. Edward King and Edward King also pleaded in unison. Third uncle, tell that rebellious son that if he can provide evidence to prove his innocence, I will be lenient. If not, he should end it himself. The harsh words of Alexander King made Eleanor Bennet sigh. Indeed, there is no familial love in the royal family, yet she admired Alexander King, a ruler who prioritized his people, which was truly admirable. Your servant obeys. Edward King accepted the order. Your Majesty, the Imperial Pharmacy will deliver the medicine shortly. You must rest and recuperate in the coming days. Eleanor Bennet packed up her medical kit, preparing to leave. It's not that I don't want to rest, but fate is unkind. Alexander King sighed helplessly. I have something to say, but I'm unsure if I should. Eleanor Bennet responded. You may speak freely. Your Majesty is busy with countless affairs every day. Why not take this opportunity to rest a bit? You have many princes, why not entrust state affairs to them, giving them a chance to gain experience? Eleanor Bennet's bold suggestion surprised everyone. Alexander King merely smiled at her, leaving his thoughts unreadable. I find this idea feasible. I am old and should let go. Alexander King looked at Edward King and Charles King, seemingly contemplating something. Announce the decree, appoint 3rd Prince Edward King as King of Jing, and 9th Prince Charles King as King of Yi. From today, they will jointly handle state affairs. Instruct the Ministry of Internal Affairs to select locations outside the palace to build residences for King of Jing and King of Yi. The decree, once announced, astonished everyone again. Eleanor Bennet admired the emperor even more. The two princes managed state affairs together, avoiding autocracy while observing who was more suitable to inherit the throne. It seemed that the crown prince position would surely belong to one of them. We obey your command. Everyone knelt down in gratitude. Eleanor Bennet left the Hall of Heavenly Purity, preparing to return to the Imperial Medical Institute. Unexpectedly, she saw Edward King and Richard King standing in the distance under the corridor. Greetings to Richard King and 4th Highness. Eleanor Bennet knew they were waiting for her on purpose. Eleanor Bennet, the wound on your face. Edward King stepped forward to help Eleanor Bennet, who was kneeling. He already knew what Consort Young had done. Thank you for your concern, Your Highness, it's fine now. Eleanor Bennet avoided his touch. Third brother, I just remembered I have something to do, I'll leave first. Edward King knew Edward King had something to say to Eleanor Bennet and tactfully left. Eleanor Bennet. Edward King grabbed Eleanor Bennet's hand, looking at her with deep emotion. Please respect yourself, Your Highness. Eleanor Bennet stepped back in panic. Eleanor Bennet, could it be that you still don't understand my feelings? Edward King was slightly frustrated, she seemed to strongly reject him. Eleanor Bennet thanks Your Highness for your assistance at the Spring Full Pavilion, but as for Your Highness's feelings, I'm afraid I cannot accept them. She had witnessed the cold-heartedness of the royal family, and besides, he was not the one life, one love, one partner she sought. Could it be that you already have someone in your heart? Edward King hadn't expected Eleanor Bennet to reject him so bluntly, feeling somewhat unwilling to accept it. Your Highness, we are worlds apart. Your Highness's kindness, Eleanor Bennet truly cannot accept. Eleanor Bennet didn't wish to prolong this any further and made her farewell with a bow. I will not give up. If you desire the position of Crown Princess, I will grant it to you. Your Highness is so certain, are you sure the position of Crown Princess is yours to give? Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly. Perhaps many women coveted the title of Crown Princess, but she had no interest in such a cold and desolate status. I am determined to attain it. Edward King appeared very confident. Eleanor Bennet fails to understand, sacrificing fatherly love and brotherly bonds for such a position, is it truly worth it? Eleanor Bennet cast a cold glance at Edward King before swiftly leaving. She left Edward King somewhat bewildered. Just what kind of woman was she? A woman with a mind full of schemes, yet carrying a serene and detached nature, far removed from worldly desires. She was like a riddle, captivating his thoughts and his emotions. Charles King received the imperial decree appointing him as Duke of Wing, yet he showed no particular joy. His face remained cold and unreadable, making it impossible to discern his thoughts. Your Highness, this old servant takes his leave. Eunuch Liam prepared to depart and returned to the palace to report. This 9th prince was famously aloof, his thoughts even more unpredictable and ever-changing. Suffering from a chronic cold illness, he seldom participated in court affairs, yet he was especially favored by the emperor. Eunuch Liam understood well that this 9th prince was the ideal heir in the emperor's eyes. This decree only further confirmed his suspicions. Eunuch Liam, how is the Emperor's health? Charles King asked, holding on to the fireplace as he sat on the chair. His Majesty's health has greatly improved after being treated by Dr. Bennet. It is believed that he will soon be able to walk again. Please, Your Highness, do not worry, Eunuch Liam replied. Dr. Bennet? She is the maid who once served tea in the Hall of Heavenly Purity. Lord Bennet possesses exceptional medical skills and saved His Majesty during a critical moment. The Emperor has issued a decree promoting her to the rank of scholar in the Imperial Medical Institute, Eunuch Liam explained. Charles King recalled the righteous woman from that night. Indeed, she was no ordinary person. Seeing Charles King's face grow even colder, Eunuch Liam quickly excused himself and left. Charles King sat alone in the dimly lit hall, sipping tea. Not far from the bed, the flickering firelight illuminated his unparalleled features, but it only made him seem more lonely and desolate. At that moment, a palace attendant hurriedly entered from outside the hall. Your servant greets Your Highness, the Prince. The attendant bowed respectfully. Have the investigations been thoroughly completed? Charles King asked emotionlessly. The first prince has been imprisoned in the heavenly prison. His Majesty has ordered King Edward to oversee the interrogation. Get to the point. Charles King replied impatiently. It seems the first prince possesses something the Duke of Stirling desires, the attendant responded. Oh. That fool isn't completely brainless after all. Charles King sneered coldly. Send someone to watch over the heavenly prison. The Duke of Stirling will undoubtedly take action. It's best to secure what the first prince has. Charles King commanded. My lord, there is one matter I'm unsure whether to report or not, the attendant hesitated. Speak freely. This time, His Majesty rewarded you and the third prince, seemingly influenced by Eleanor Bennet's recommendation. That Eleanor Bennet rose overnight from a palace maid to a scholar at the Imperial Medical Institute, it's truly unbelievable. I suspect her identity. The attendant cautiously analyzed. Her identity is not fabricated, merely extraordinary. Charles King, having witnessed Eleanor Bennet's medical skills firsthand, was unsurprised. I'll handle matters concerning her myself. Focus on your duties. Charles King gestured for the attendant to withdraw. Charles King considered Eleanor Bennet to be nothing more than a highly unique young woman, likely unrelated to the matters he was most concerned with. Blood Shadow. Charles King called toward the shadows, where a dark figure emerged and knelt before him. My lord. Keep an eye on David King. The ledgers may be in his possession. Understood. Blood Shadow vanished without a trace. The grand hall was shrouded in darkness, eerily silent. The golden glazed tiles of the roof were coated with a thick layer of silver frost. The early winter chill spread throughout the hall of morning flowers, the flickering light from the charcoal stove gradually dimming until extinguished. Only Charles King remained, enduring the bone-piercing cold that seeped into him. Perhaps this cold would haunt him for life, a persistent pain, a shadow that would never leave. Chapter 18, Two princes attend court in the Tuen Chin Hall. Civil and military officials were waiting for the emperor to attend court. Yesterday, the imperial decree appointing King Edward and King as regents was issued, leaving the ministers astonished. It seemed that Bryn's fate was on the verge of transformation. Arthur Bennet stood calmly in the hall, completely unbothered by the murmurs around him. Congratulations, Lord Bennet. Prime Minister Ethan Farmer approached with a cheerful smile to strike up a conversation. Prime Minister Ethan, you're joking. What joyous occasion could there be for someone like me? Arthur Bennet forced a smile, pretending not to understand. Why, your daughter is now the chief female official of Bryn and highly trusted by His Majesty. Isn't that a great cause for celebration? Ethan Farmer replied with a knowing smile. Prime Minister Ethan, you're too kind. It's all thanks to the mighty grace of the Emperor, he said, bowing in gratitude. Megan Bennet, you're being modest. With achievements like Miss Bennet's, there may be no other in the world, Minister Thomas interjected with flattery. Indeed, Sir Bennet has a remarkable way of raising his daughter. Several other ministers chimed in agreement. Arthur Bennet felt delighted inside but maintained a humble demeanor. Eleanor Bennet's performance at the court truly exceeded his expectations. He was puzzled as well, since losing her memory, Eleanor seemed like a different person, with a changed personality and aura. Even her medical skills, when had she learned them? He had many questions himself. Could it really be divine intervention? His Highness has arrived, came the clear announcement from the attendant outside. A man with a commanding presence entered the hall. He wore a white silk robe adorned with dragons soaring through clouds, a gold crown with white jade, and a premium jade belt, with jewels glistening brightly. His cloak, embroidered with silver threads and flowers, along with snow-patterned boots, enhanced his handsome and extraordinary appearance. Edward King ascended the jade steps of the grand hall and took his seat on the rosewood chair beneath the imperial throne. His gaze swept over the courtiers paying their respects, and he offered a warm smile. The Duke of York has arrived, another clear announcement echoed. Everyone turned their heads, followed by a series of coughs. Charles King, dressed in a dark purple robe embroidered with lifelike dragons and phoenixes, wore a gold crown with purple jade and a cloak of white mink fur. His complexion remained pale as mist, with a demeanor as cold as ice. He slowly ascended the jade steps, holding a gold hand warmer engraved with dragons and phoenixes, and sat on the opposite rosewood chair. He occasionally covered his mouth with a silk handkerchief to cough. "Today, you seem to be in much better spirits, ninth brother," Edward King remarked with concern. "Thank you, third brother, for your concern. It's still the same as before." Charles King responded with a cold smile, his sharp gaze sweeping over the courtiers below. "We pay our respects to your Highness, the Duke of York. May your Highness live for 10,000 years. Amidst the resounding cries of the courtiers, Bryn opened up a new chapter. Everyone understood that the upcoming battle for the throne would undoubtedly be a fierce contest between the two princes seated above. Their choices would determine their future careers and prosperity. A single misstep could not only cost them their positions but might also endanger their lives. The whole kingdom knew that the emperor deeply favored the ninth prince, the sole son of the late empress. If not for his terminal illness, he would have long been named crown prince. However, in recent years, the third prince's power had been rising like a soaring kite, leaving the outcome of this struggle uncertain. This court had always been a brutal battlefield, where the hidden conflicts were even more terrifying than blood-soaked wars. The emperor is gravely ill. If the ministers have matters to report, speak now. If not, court is dismissed. Edward King cast a glance at Charles King, whose expression remained icy, and frowned slightly. "As you command." The courtiers responded in unison. "Prime Minister Ethan, the triennial imperial examination is approaching. Have the preparations been made?" Charles King directed his gaze at Ethan Farmer, who stood respectfully below, his tone calm yet composed. "Your Highness, everything is in preparation." Ethan Farmer was startled. He always felt that the Duke was not as weak as he appeared. This year, why not let Megan Bennet oversee the examinations? "What do you think, third brother?" Edward King was surprised that Charles King suddenly brought up the exams and even boldly suggested Arthur Bennet. Could it be because of Eleanor Bennet? Edward King recalled Eleanor Bennet's words that day, along with her indifferent attitude towards his feelings. Doubt began to rise in his heart. Was Eleanor Bennet deliberately placed beside the king by the ninth prince? "Megan Bennet is a top scholar, ninth brother, you have a keen eye," Edward King agreed nonchalantly. "I will give it my all." Arthur Bennet was also taken aback. The Duke's obvious favoritism might not bode well. "If there's nothing else to present, court is adjourned." Charles King coughed a few times, appearing unwell. Third brother, I'm not feeling well, so I must excuse myself. Farewell, your highness. Charles King glanced at Edward King sitting on the throne and, under the watchful eyes of everyone, left the hall. Edward King's eyes were filled with envy. From a young age, Charles King had always been proud, aloof, and fearless. The king's favoritism towards him only fueled Edward's resentment. Was it just because he was the queen's son? Or because he had an incurable disease? Fate seemed fair, afflicting him with a chronic illness, tormenting him with cold poison for life. After the court session, Edward King immediately summoned James King and Richard King. They hurried to the Palace of Scenic Blossoms, finding Edward King with a gloomy expression, sitting on the bed. Third brother, are you still troubled by what happened in court? James King, upon sitting down, knew Edward King's worries were undoubtedly related to the Bennet family. Do you think Arthur Bennet is with the 9th prince? In truth, Edward King didn't want to believe Arthur Bennet had allied with the 9th prince. If that were true, he and Eleanor Bennet would become adversaries. He wasn't lacking in women, but Eleanor Bennet was the only one who could touch his heart. How could he let someone else have the person he cherished? Third brother, your concern for Arthur Bennet is surely because of Eleanor Bennet. James King felt uneasy. He worried that Eleanor Bennet might become Edward King's fatal weakness. Those destined for greatness must not be ensnared by romantic feelings. Third brother, I feel like today's events were deliberately orchestrated by Old Ninth for us to witness, Richard King remarked while examining a red coral statue in the hall. Fifth brother, why do you think so? Edward King asked. Old Ninth is testing us because he isn't sure if Arthur Bennet is one of our people or not. The strange thing is, Eleanor Bennet stands out so much that even Old Ninth is wary of her. This testing the waters tactic of his is indeed clever. Richard King seemed quite fond of the red coral statue before him, turning it over repeatedly to admire it. Fifth brother, it's rare for you to have such sharp insight. Edward King teased as he stood beside him. Old Ninth is inherently cunning, there's no way he'd easily expose his own people, Richard King said, clearly well acquainted with Charles King's ways. Fifth brother, you make a good point. Edward King's expression softened. Based on Old Ninth's usual methods, things were indeed unlikely to be that simple. Third brother, where did you get this treasure? Richard King shifted the topic, his gaze fixed on the red coral. If you like it, take it, Edward King offered without hesitation, gifting it to Richard King. Though they were not born of the same mother, they had been close since childhood. Alexander King only cared about Charles King, rarely paying attention to his other sons. Perhaps because of their shared neglect, they harbored mutual resentment toward Old Ninth. Third brother, now that you and Old Ninth are jointly managing state affairs, this is an opportunity for us. If we can gain the support of more court officials, the position of Crown Prince will surely be yours, Edward King hinted, but refrained from saying more. Fourth brother, are you suggesting that third brother should ally with the Duke of Stirling? Richard King bluntly voiced Edward King's unspoken thoughts. Third brother, the first prince has already fallen out of favor. The most powerful faction in court now belongs to the Empress Dowager's family, the So clan. With their support, even if father favors Old Ninth, he won't be able to do much. Edward King analyzed the situation, hoping his brother would temporarily set aside his grudge against the So clan. I'll think it over carefully, Edward King replied, signaling the two to leave. The enmity over his mother's death was irreconcilable, but fourth brother's words were not without reason. The influence of the So clan could not be underestimated. Meanwhile, Eleanor Bennet was at the Imperial Medical Institute reviewing diagnostic records of the palace residents. Most were minor ailments, living on tonics daily without illness would indeed be unusual. Eleanor Bennet organized the disordered records on the table, preparing them to be returned to storage. At that moment, she pulled out a record from the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. The worn cover suggested it was quite old. Palace of Scenic Blossoms? Wasn't that Edward King's residence? Eleanor Bennet opened it and found it to be the medical records of concubine Violet, Edward King's mother. Skimming the first few pages revealed nothing unusual, just routine diagnoses. But as she flipped to the last pages, she discovered something peculiar. Eleanor Bennet couldn't understand how someone seemingly healthy could suddenly pass away within just 3 days. Eleanor Bennet continued to search through the older medical records beneath the bookshelf and discovered a peculiar one. It was written in golden ink, identical to the color associated with Alexander King. Carefully flipping through the pages, she realized it was the medical file of the Empress. As she turned to the final pages, she noticed an astonishing similarity to the records of concubine Violet. Could there be a hidden truth behind the deaths of the Empress and concubine Violet? A chill ran down Eleanor Bennet's spine. Both women, who had borne heirs within the palace at different times, had died from the same cause. If this wasn't a conspiracy, what else could it be? Eleanor Bennet recalled hearing rumors upon entering the palace that the emperor had once adored concubine Violet to the extent of considering her for the position of empress. Tragically, her youthful beauty was cut short, and she passed away untimely. Later, the emperor wed the princess from the southern kingdom of Valdora, who became the empress and the mother of Charles King. Alexander King cherished her even more deeply than concubine Violet. Yet, she too met an early demise. Why did the two women most beloved by the emperor share such a fate? And what was the story behind the cold energy within Charles King's body? Eleanor Bennet realized this could not be mere coincidence, it was undoubtedly a conspiracy. Would the mastermind behind this scheme strike again? It seemed their target was always the emperor's favored consorts, all of whom left behind heirs. Eleanor Bennet looked at the two medical records, her resolve firm to uncover the one responsible for this plot. Lady Bennet. A palace maid waited outside the door. What is it? Eleanor Bennet tucked away the records and asked. A message has just arrived from outside the palace. It says that Lady Bennet's mother is gravely ill. Lady Bennet, they hope you can return home to visit her when you have the time, the maid replied with her head lowered. Lady Bennet's mother, gravely ill? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel suspicious. No longer bound by palace duties, she was free to return home. It wasn't surprising that Arthur Bennet would send someone to deliver the news. Please inform Lady Bennet that tomorrow at the hour of the rooster, she should send someone to wait for me outside the palace to escort me home, Eleanor Bennet said with a cold smile, reflecting on her experiences since entering the palace. Surely, Arthur Bennet had his own doubts as well. The maid withdrew, and Eleanor Bennet watched her retreating figure, convinced that this person was undoubtedly one of Arthur Bennet's informants within the palace. Chapter 19. Testing the waters. The next day, at the hour of the rooster, Eleanor Bennet exited the Radiant Sun Gate and immediately saw the Bennet family's butler standing by the carriage, waiting. Miss. The master has sent me to escort you back to the estate, the butler said, almost not recognizing Eleanor Bennet in her official attire. Thank you for your trouble. Eleanor Bennet boarded the carriage, leaving the royal palace. She hadn't expected to leave so quickly, which was entirely against her original plan. As she closed her eyes to rest, she decided that tonight she would probe Arthur Bennet, hoping he might have some clues about the past events in the harem. Miss, we've arrived. The carriage came to a stop, and the butler announced from outside. Eleanor Bennet got off the carriage and saw Arthur Bennet and Mrs. Bennet waiting in front of the estate. The entire Bennet family estate was brightly lit, as if they were especially welcoming her. Eleanor greets father and mother. Eleanor Bennet stepped forward and bowed. I never imagined my Eleanor would don official robes, truly a dragon among men, Mrs. Bennet said, hardly believing her eyes until she saw the embroidered crane on Eleanor's attire, confirming it was all real. Madam, let's bring Eleanor inside to rest. Arthur Bennet seemed extremely pleased, surely feeling that their ancestors were watching over them. Everyone surrounded Eleanor Bennet as they entered the estate, with the entire Bennet household in high spirits. Eleanor Bennet chatted briefly with Mrs. Bennet before returning to her room. Clara Young was eagerly waiting outside. Miss. As soon as she saw Eleanor Bennet, she joyfully ran to greet her. Clara Young, how have you been lately? Eleanor Bennet asked, equally delighted. Miss, Clara Young has been well. Clara Young couldn't help but reach out to touch Eleanor's official attire. Miss, are you really the chief female official of Bryn now? Clara Young still couldn't quite believe her eyes, her face beaming with a bright smile. Yes. Let me bathe and change first, all right. Eleanor Bennet playfully pinched Clara Young's cheek. Miss, the water is ready. Clara Young followed Eleanor Bennet into the room, assisting her with the bath. As Eleanor stepped into the flower-filled tub, her fatigue began to melt away. Miss, was it good in the palace? Clara Young asked while helping Eleanor undress. Good, of course, it was good. Eleanor Bennet replied, eyes closed, leaning against the tub to rest. Now that you're no longer a court lady, you can visit home more often. Madam won't have to shed tears missing you, Clara Young said while brushing Eleanor's long black hair. Clara Young, did mother often cry while I was in the palace? Eleanor Bennet asked, stepping out of the bath. In the Bennet family, her mother was the only one she couldn't stop worrying about. Yes, Madam often cried quietly, Clara Young replied, helping Eleanor dress, her natural beauty shining brightly. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the hall, where the maids stood attentively on either side. Arthur Bennet and Lady Bennet were waiting for Eleanor to join them for dinner. Father, Mother. Eleanor beamed as she sat down next to Lady Bennet. Eleanor, I still prefer you in women's clothing. Lady Bennet expressed her delight. Mother, I'll make sure to wear dresses whenever I come home. Eleanor playfully promised Lady Bennet. My dear, Eleanor must be hungry, let's start the meal. Arthur Bennet said, serving Eleanor a piece of fish. The warm and harmonious family scene made Eleanor cherish such moments. After dinner, Eleanor accompanied Lady Bennet to the Buddhist temple, then proceeded to the study to find Arthur Bennet. Father. Eleanor called out as she entered, seeing Arthur Bennet bent over his desk. Eleanor, have a seat. Arthur Bennet put down his pen and sat beside her. Eleanor, is the Emperor's health still good? Arthur Bennet inquired, knowing Eleanor was the Emperor's chief physician. The Emperor has recovered very well. Eleanor replied, sipping tea and wondering what Arthur wanted to discuss. Our ancestors must be watching over us. First, your brother Henry passed the military exam with flying colors, and now you, my daughter, are achieving great things. It's truly an honor for the Bennet family. Arthur expressed his pride. Father, just don't blame me for being too strong-willed. Eleanor teased. Eleanor, why would I? I'm overjoyed. Arthur laughed. But the truth is, I've caused trouble for the Bennet family, Eleanor admitted, aware of Arthur's role in overseeing the imperial examination. Eleanor, you already know. Father, you cannot oversee the final exam. Eleanor insisted firmly. Why? Arthur was aware this was a test from King but was surprised Eleanor saw through it. If you oversee the exam, it would put you in a difficult position. I believe you understand Prince Dika's intentions, Eleanor stated, determined to protect the Bennet family. Of course, I know, but I haven't figured out a solution yet, Arthur frowned. How about retreating to advance? Eleanor suggested, having thought of a plan. Eleanor, you already have a strategy? Arthur was a bit astonished. Eleanor shared her ideas, and Arthur nodded in approval. Eleanor, if you weren't my daughter, you'd surely be a prime minister. Arthur couldn't help but admire her insight. Father, there's something I want to ask. Eleanor said, thinking of concubine Violet and the Empress, suspecting Arthur might know something. Go ahead, Eleanor. Father, do you know why concubine Violet and the Empress passed away in the past? Eleanor, why are you suddenly asking about this? Arthur Bennet's expression turned serious, as if he didn't want to discuss the matter. I was just reviewing some old medical records and happened to come across the cases of concubine Violet and the Empress, so I got a bit curious. Eleanor Bennet smiled lightly, feigning indifference. Eleanor, the matter of concubine Violet and the Empress is taboo in the palace. Remember not to bring it up again. Arthur Bennet spoke sternly. Father, is there truly something hidden in this matter? Eleanor Bennet realized her suspicion might be correct. In the harem, there's never a clear right or wrong. You've escaped the cage, don't invite trouble upon yourself. Remember, from now on, act wisely in the palace and don't meddle in unrelated affairs. The matter of the Empress and concubine Violet is not to be mentioned again. Arthur Bennet's warning gaze made Eleanor Bennet understand she wouldn't get answers from him. Yet, it only confirmed her suspicion that a powerful force was behind this. Looking across Bryn, aside from the Emperor, only the influential So family could have such capability. But what was their motive for harming the harem? Could it simply be a struggle for favor? The fog grew thicker, hiding the truth, yet bringing her closer to the answer. Eleanor Bennet left the study, gazing at the crescent moon above. The moonlight poured down like gentle autumn water, carrying the chill of the night breeze, reminding her of someone. That person's demeanor, their somber aura, mirrored the night. And like this night, it was filled with a vague sadness. Eleanor Bennet knew she must be crazy. How could a solitary, proud person like David King evoke such melancholy? Yet every time she met him, an unnamed sadness arose in her heart. Lord Bennet. Eleanor Bennet was lost in thought, unaware of the shadow beside her. It's you. Eleanor Bennet recognized the newcomer. The prince requests your presence. Blood Shadow said, then swiftly carried her onto the rooftop, disappearing into the night. Chapter 20, Moon in the Water. Blood Shadow led Eleanor Bennet to a bamboo forest, where a faint glimpse of a bamboo house could be seen in the distance, with dim lights flickering inside. Master Bennet, the prince is inside. Here is the needle pouch for you. Blood Shadow handed the silver needle pouch to Eleanor Bennet, and she realized he had intentionally waited for her at the Bennet residence garden. What happened to the prince? Eleanor Bennet understood that Blood Shadow had invited her to diagnose an illness. The prince has been poisoned by cold toxins, and Dr. Moore is not in the capital. I had no choice but to presumptuously invite you here. Please forgive any rudeness. Eleanor Bennet knew he was anxious to save his master, so she did not blame him. Cold toxins. Your prince has been poisoned. Eleanor Bennet still couldn't fully comprehend the cold aura lingering within Charles King's body. She didn't expect it to actually be poison. Yes, this poison takes time to manifest. When it does, it feels as if the 5 internal organs are frozen solid, causing excruciating pain. Blood Shadow recalled his master's torment, the agony so intense it was worse than death, and his heart ached deeply. Eleanor Bennet walked alone into the bamboo house. Beyond the silk screen, she caught sight of a marble hot spring, its water bubbling continuously with steam rising thickly into the air. She realized this was a modified hot spring. Slowly approaching the pool, she saw no sign of Charles King. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the water, startling Eleanor Bennet and causing her to step back quickly. Why is it you? Charles King frowned, dressed in only a thin silk robe, his wet hair clinging to his face. His firm chest was faintly visible beneath the damp fabric. Who said only women could possess beauty akin to a water lotus? This man before her was even more captivating than any woman. Eleanor Bennet blushed, never expecting to encounter Charles King in such a situation. It was all that cold-faced subordinate's fault. Why hadn't he warned? For this was a hot spring. Isn't it your loyal subordinate who specifically invited me to examine you? Eleanor Bennet avoided his icy gaze, feeling as though she had been killed countless times by those cold eyes. But seeing how refreshed you look, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong, does there? Eleanor Bennet was eager to escape this stifling atmosphere, but before she could, Charles King grabbed her ankle, causing her to lose her balance and fall into the water. Submerged, she quickly swam back up. The water here was so warm. You can swim. Charles King looked at her as though he had discovered a new continent, his eyes filled with surprise. After nearly drowning once, I learned. Eleanor Bennet responded quickly, recalling the time the former Eleanor Bennet had drowned. Charles King was truly cunning, so he had been testing her. Who are you, really? Charles King's gaze turned ambiguous, fixating on Eleanor Bennet's alluring figure. Who else but Eleanor Bennet? She hurriedly crossed her arms over her chest, warily retreating toward the edge of the pool. Charles King sneered coldly, pulling her into his embrace. His icy lips immediately pressed against hers. Eleanor Bennet struggled desperately, but he held her tightly. Her mind spun, and his warm breath made her feel suffocated. Her cheeks flushed even more as she lost all strength to resist. Suddenly, Charles King seemed to be in great pain and released Eleanor Bennet. She pushed him away and swam toward the shore of the lake. Turning back, she couldn't see Charles King anywhere. Eleanor Bennet was horrified. Had he drowned? His pained expression earlier didn't seem fake. Taking a deep breath, she dived underwater and saw Charles King slowly sinking. Eleanor Bennet grabbed him and pulled him to the surface. His body was cold as ice. Even while immersed in this hot spring, there was no warmth to be felt. At this moment, Charles King had fallen unconscious. Was this the onset of the cold poison? Eleanor Bennet mustered all her strength to drag him to the shore. She noticed a soft bed behind a thin curtain and dried him off before laying him down, covering him with a snow-patterned silk quilt. Then, she returned to the water to retrieve her fallen acupuncture bag. She removed her soaked outer garment, leaving only a thin watercolored undergarment and a silk skirt. At this point, she didn't care about anything else, saving his life was the priority. After all, in modern times, dressing like this wouldn't be unusual. Eleanor Bennet quickly prepared her needles and began administering acupuncture to relieve Charles King's pain. Carefully checking his pulse, she discovered a strange poison that didn't take one's life but left the body icy cold. She noticed the cold energy in his body seemed to have subsided significantly. After applying needles to a few critical points, Charles King gradually regained consciousness. You're fine now. I'll be leaving. Seeing his complexion improve, Eleanor Bennet assumed there was no longer a problem and spoke. Charles King slowly sat up, leaning against the soft velvet cushion, his gaze lingering on Eleanor Bennet. You saved me. Charles King smiled, but his expression quickly returned to its usual coldness. I didn't want to save you. Eleanor Bennet replied, reaching for the cloak on the rack. After all, she couldn't leave in her current state. Charles King saw her intention and swiftly pulled Eleanor Bennet back onto the bed. Off balance, she fell onto him. If you keep staring, I'll gouge your eyes out. Eleanor Bennet glared furiously at Charles King, who was grinning mischievously, his gaze fixed on her nearly exposed chest. You're the one seducing me. Charles King flipped their positions, pinning Eleanor Bennet beneath him. She struggled desperately. Wouldn't it be better to be my woman? Charles King whispered softly into her ear. It was the first time he felt the desire to possess a woman. His father had once suggested taking a consort for him, but he had always refused, citing his frail health. The women he encountered were all too fake, making him loathe them, until he met her. Her intelligence, composure, wisdom, and unique demeanor set her apart. A woman like her, if not possessed, must be destroyed. Eleanor Bennet noticed a sudden flash of murderous intent in his previously gentle eyes. What was this man planning? Not every woman wants to marry you, at least I don't. Eleanor Bennet seized the moment when he was distracted and pushed him away. She wrapped the cloak around herself and stood firm. The struggle between you and King Edward has nothing to do with the Bennet family. I am certain that the Bennet family will not get involved. So, you'd better not think about using the Bennet family to achieve your goals. Eleanor Bennet coldly and decisively stared at Charles King, her gaze both a warning and a declaration of war. Woman, you have quite the audacity. Do you know? I can destroy the Bennet family at any moment. Charles King's icy eyes brimmed with murderous intent. I certainly don't doubt your capabilities, but I will also give my all to protect the Bennet family. If His Highness the Winged King wants another enemy, Eleanor Bennet is ready to face you. Eleanor Bennet showed no fear in the face of his threat and stepped straight out of the hot spring. Charles King clenched the jade ring in his hand tightly, his anger flaring. Eleanor Bennet, you'd better not become my enemy, or I will destroy you without hesitation. As soon as she stepped outside, Eleanor Bennet saw Blood Shadow waiting for her. Blood Shadow glanced at Eleanor Bennet's attire, seemingly understanding something. Lady Bennet, how is the prince? Blood Shadow asked worriedly, looking toward the bamboo house. He is fine. That kind of man deserves to suffer from such a strange poison. Thinking about Charles King's arrogant behavior earlier, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but wish she could kill him. However, her rationality reminded her that provoking this man was unwise. Becoming his enemy would undoubtedly be a grave mistake. As long as the Bennet family remained neutral, perhaps they could avoid the risk of annihilation. Eleanor Bennet stayed awake all night and returned to the royal palace early the next morning. Alexander King had recovered well and was already able to get out of bed and walk around. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the Hall of Heavenly Purity, Lady Bennet. Eunuch Liam greeted her with a smile and a bow. Eunuch Liam, please announce my arrival, Eleanor Bennet responded courteously. His Majesty has ordered that when you arrive, there is no need for an announcement. You may enter the hall directly. Eleanor Bennet smiled and stepped into the inner chamber. As soon as she entered, she saw Edward King and Charles King both present. The two men glanced at Eleanor Bennet simultaneously before quickly averting their gazes. Eleanor Bennet greets His Majesty. Eleanor Bennet knelt down to pay her respects. Eleanor Bennet, you may rise. Alexander King seemed to be in a very good mood today, smiling warmly. Father, today Megan Bennet has excused herself from court due to illness. With the upcoming imperial examination, someone needs to oversee it. I seek your guidance on whom to appoint. Edward King glanced at Eleanor Bennet calmly. Was Arthur Bennet's illness intentional at this time? Is Arthur Bennet ill? Alexander King turned to ask Eleanor Bennet. Your Majesty, a few days ago when I returned home, my father was still in good health. Eleanor Bennet appeared completely unaware. Arthur Bennet is a pillar of the nation. Eleanor Bennet, perhaps you could pay him a visit and check on him. Alexander King smiled warmly. Your Majesty, today I must attend to your massage therapy, so it's inconvenient for me. May I trouble Imperial Physician Zhang to make the trip instead? No one expected Eleanor Bennet to find an excuse to decline. Very well. Alexander King understood that Eleanor Bennet was avoiding suspicion and couldn't help but admire her cleverness. If Arthur Bennet is indeed ill, the imperial examination will be overseen by Minister Page. Alexander King instructed Edward King. Your son obeys the order. Third son, regarding the situation in Kamzhou, has that rebellious son confessed his crimes yet? Alexander King mentioned David King, his anger barely restrained. Your Majesty, the Crown Prince requests an audience. Edward King recalled David King in the dungeon. Could it be that he truly holds leverage against the Duke of Stirling? Humph. I understand. You may leave now. Alexander King gestured for Edward King to withdraw. Your son takes his leave. Edward King glanced at Charles King with resentment. In their father's eyes, no matter how outstanding he was, he never received recognition, not even a fleeting glance. Eleanor Bennet noticed the jealousy in Edward King's eyes but couldn't comprehend why, despite being siblings, there was such a stark difference in treatment. Eleanor Bennet, I grant you permission to visit Arthur Bennet today. Since you understand the importance of avoiding suspicion, I must uphold propriety. Alexander King observed Eleanor Bennet's distracted demeanor, assuming she was concerned about Arthur Bennet's health. Your Majesty, I humbly thank you for your grace. Eleanor Bennet, slightly startled, quickly knelt to express her gratitude, her face showing a hint of confusion. Charles, how has your health been lately? Alexander King looked at Charles King sitting not far away, his gaze filled with affection. It's still the same. I've made father worry again. Charles King replied calmly. I truly feel ashamed before your mother. Alexander King sighed with guilt. This is my fate, father. Please don't blame yourself. Charles King comforted him. Where did the cold poison in Charles King's body come from? Why did it cause Alexander King so much sorrow? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel puzzled. Father, I have a request to make. Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet, a mysterious smile appearing on his face. That look caught Eleanor Bennet's attention, giving her an uneasy feeling. Charles, whatever it is, father agrees. Eleanor Bennet observed the doting expression Alexander King had for Charles King and couldn't help but sigh. No wonder the other princes envied Charles King. Father, I wish to invite Dr. Bennet to treat me. Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King and immediately realized he was doing this on purpose. I must have been so careless, relying on Physician Yu to oversee your treatment and forgetting the exceptional skills of Eleanor Bennet, Alexander King said with a laugh. Eleanor Bennet, starting tomorrow, you will be in charge of treating the Wing Prince's illness. With you and Physician Yu, I trust Charles will recover. I will do my best. Eleanor Bennet accepted the order, inwardly cursing Charles King. So, every time Physician Yu Daniel entered the palace, it was to treat him. Thinking about him, her heart involuntarily warmed a little. Your Majesty, concubine Florence requests an audience. Court eunuch Li entered the hall to report. All right, summon her in. Alexander King leaned against the dragon bed, looking weary. I take my leave. Eleanor Bennet packed up her medical kit and withdrew just in time. As she stepped out of the hall, she came face to face with the stunningly beautiful concubine Florence. Greetings, concubine Florence. Eleanor Bennet knelt to pay her respects. Please rise, Dr. Bennet. Is His Majesty in good health today? Concubine Florence asked with a smile. His Majesty is in excellent health. Eleanor Bennet replied with a bow. Your Ladyship, His Majesty awaits you. Court eunuch Liam stepped forward to announce. Dr. Bennet, drop by the floral pavilion when you're free. Concubine Florence said before entering the great hall. Eleanor Bennet watched her figure disappear, her thoughts turning to the late concubine Violet and the Empress. Today, Alexander King's expression of guilt when mentioning the Empress didn't seem feigned. However, from ancient times, emperors were often fickle in love. No matter how deep their affection, new love would always overshadow the old. Dr. Bennet seems to particularly enjoy daydreaming. Charles King had appeared beside Eleanor Bennet without her noticing, his tone laced with provocation. The subject greets His Highness and has other matters to attend to. May I take my leave? Eleanor Bennet wished to depart quickly. Lord Bennet, this retreat to advance strategy of yours is indeed executed flawlessly. Charles King sneered coldly. This woman truly had a meticulous mind. Your Highness, the subject dares not misinterpret your words. Eleanor Bennet had already anticipated that her small ploy would not escape Charles King's sharp eyes. Lord Bennet is intelligent and resourceful, how could you not understand? My illness will trouble you in the future. Charles King let out a cold laugh. I will do my utmost. Eleanor Bennet knew he would use this tactic. That night at the hot spring, she realized he wouldn't let her go so easily. Watching his retreating figure, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire Charles King's acting skills. This man was truly petty. After all, she had saved him twice. The problem was, she didn't even know when she had offended him. She could only blame herself for meddling unnecessarily at the Golden Flower Temple. Feeling a pang of melancholy, Eleanor Bennet returned to the Imperial Medical Institute. As soon as she entered the Imperial Medical Institute, she saw several senior imperial physicians waiting in the courtyard, seemingly there for her. Currently, Eleanor Bennet was in charge of the institute, but they harbored dissatisfaction. They dared not voice it openly, constrained by the Emperor's authority. "Are the esteemed gentlemen waiting for Eleanor Bennet?" Eleanor Bennet spoke with authority, yet without anger. "Lord Bennet, this old man is advanced in age and wishes to request a few days off to recuperate." The senior physician, surnamed Zhang, took the lead, clearly intending to make things difficult. Eleanor Bennet assessed the situation and merely smirked coldly. "Do all the esteemed gentlemen wish to return home to recuperate?" Eleanor Bennet's gaze swept coldly across the group. "Indeed." The imperial physicians behind Zhang hesitated, casting sidelong glances at him. Eleanor Bennet understood this was Zhang's attempt to intimidate her. He knew that if the entire Imperial Medical Institute simultaneously requested leave, she would find herself in an impossible position. If the esteemed gentlemen are unwell, Eleanor Bennet will, of course, grant leave. However, the Imperial Medical Institute serves the sovereign, and negligence is unacceptable. If you are unwell while treating others, wouldn't that be Eleanor Bennet's oversight? Tomorrow, I shall report to His Majesty. Perhaps it would be better for the esteemed gentleman to retire and return home permanently. What do you think? Eleanor Bennet observed their reactions. Upon hearing the phrase, retire and return home, their faces turned pale. She knew well that these old men were reluctant to give up their lucrative positions at the Imperial Medical Institute. "Lord Bennet, this humble subject is perfectly fine. No need for your concern." The imperial physicians quickly changed their tone. "Oh. Are the esteemed gentlemen truly all right?" Eleanor Bennet deliberately pressed. "Truly, no issues at all." The imperial physicians nodded in unison. "Physician Zhang, what about you?" Eleanor Bennet turned her calm gaze toward Physician Zhang. "Your humble servant thanks the kind intentions of Your Excellency Bennet, but this old official truly wishes to retire and return to my hometown." Imperial Physician Zhang looked at Eleanor Bennet with eyes full of resentment. He could not accept being defeated by such a young woman. This humiliation was too much for him to swallow. Given his position at the Imperial Medical Institute, even the Emperor might not agree to let him retire. Eleanor Bennet had already guessed his petty schemes. She hadn't expected this old man to be so difficult to deal with. If Imperial Physician Zhang wishes to retire and return to his hometown, this prince will grant the request on behalf of the Emperor. Edward King's voice rang out as he entered the scene, though no one had noticed when he arrived. Eleanor Bennet was slightly startled as she glanced at him. How long had he been there? How much had he seen of what had just transpired? "Your servant pays respects to His Highness, Prince Jing." Everyone bowed their heads in greeting. Imperial Physician Zhang's face alternated between red and white upon seeing Edward King. "Imperial Physician Zhang, your years of service have indeed been arduous. Such a small request need not trouble the Emperor," Edward King said as he approached Eleanor Bennet, his smile warm and reassuring. "This old servant thanks His Highness, Prince Jing, for his understanding." Imperial Physician Zhang had not anticipated Prince Jing's sudden appearance, and the outcome of the day was entirely beyond his expectations. He could only accept the order and express his gratitude. The others present also realized their own impropriety and gradually took their leave. It became clear to them that the Bennet family's daughter was not someone they could afford to provoke. Eleanor Bennet thanks His Highness, Prince Jing, for coming to her aid. Eleanor Bennet bowed respectfully once the others had departed. This prince merely happened upon the scene by chance. These old men always think too highly of themselves. Today, you've managed to suppress their arrogance and teach them some humility, Edward King remarked, looking at Eleanor Bennet with admiration. His gaze carried an increasingly evident affection. Today, I truly had no other choice, Eleanor Bennet replied, suspecting that Edward King had witnessed the entire incident. Lord Bennet is gravely ill. Are you not returning to the manor to check on him today? Edward King asked. My father's illness weighs heavily on my heart as his daughter, but given my current position, I must avoid any suspicion, Eleanor Bennet explained. Then allow this prince to accompany you back to the manor. With imperial physician Zhang having resigned, Lord Bennet's condition cannot be delayed any further. Edward King's ambiguous gaze met Eleanor Bennet's, but her expression was filled only with astonishment. It seemed that peace for the Bennet family would not come easily. I thank your highness, Prince Jing, for your kind offer, Eleanor Bennet said, knowing she could not refuse. She could only bow her head in gratitude. Very well, I shall wait for you at the Radiant Sun Gate during the rooster hour. Edward King departed with a satisfied expression. Eleanor Bennet stood in the courtyard, gazing at the barren branches and fallen leaves scattered around, her heart filled with unease. Edward King's intentions were something she could never accept. She couldn't bear the thought of sharing a man with other women, especially one who was not faithful by nature. Moreover, she still had to deal with Charles King, who loomed over her like a shadow. His icy face seemed capable of taking her life on a whim. Sitting at her desk, Eleanor Bennet wore an expression of despair, sighing repeatedly. Just the thought of Charles King threw her into disarray. That man was destined to be her calamity. Chapter 21, Flowers in the Mirror. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the Radiant Sun Gate at the appointed time and immediately spotted Edward King. He was dressed in a pristine white brocade robe, draped with a jet-black mink cape, standing by the carriage awaiting her. His elegant figure in the wind reminded her of Clara Young's infatuated gaze toward him not long ago. Indeed, he was a man who could easily capture a woman's heart. Unfortunately, he was born into the cold and unfeeling royal family. Today, Eleanor Bennet was not in her official attire but wore a light yellow brocade gown paired with a soft pink silk cloak. Her long black hair, cascading like a waterfall, was neatly tied with a ribbon. Her face, lightly adorned with makeup, exuded an ethereal beauty, resembling a celestial maiden descending to the mortal world. Edward King, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, was momentarily stunned before smiling. Under the heavens, only she possessed such a pure and transcendent allure, as if untouched by the mortal realm. Your humble subject greets His Highness, Prince Edward. Eleanor Bennet stepped forward and bowed, pretending not to notice Edward King's momentary daze. Eleanor Bennet, there's no need for formalities. Edward King, regaining his composure, stepped forward, intending to hold her hand. Eleanor Bennet, however, stepped back, avoiding his touch. Let us board the carriage. Edward King, realizing his impropriety, moved aside and gestured for Eleanor Bennet to step inside. This time, she did not refuse, offering a slight smile before entering. She settled onto a soft cushion. The interior of the carriage was spacious, featuring a small table made of sandalwood, upon which rested a jade tea set. In the distance, a small brazier heated water for tea, with wisps of steam curling upward. Edward King joined her inside, seating himself beside her. The atmosphere within the carriage grew tense and ambiguous. Eleanor Bennet casually gazed out at the vibrant, lantern-lit streets through the window, ignoring Edward King's lingering gaze upon her. Eleanor Bennet, Edward King leaned against the soft cushion, sipping his tea. Your Highness, do you have any instructions? Seeing that he was no longer staring at her intently, Eleanor Bennet breathed a sigh of relief. How would you feel about being my princess? Edward King looked up at Eleanor Bennet, his eyes filled with an inexplicable fascination. You must be joking, Your Highness. Eleanor Bennet was startled. Although it wasn't the first time she heard such a bold confession from Edward King, she still blushed. "I'm serious. If you agree, I will request my father's permission for our marriage tomorrow." Edward King grasped Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, this time with a much firmer grip. Eleanor Bennet simply looked at him, not resisting. "Your Highness is kind, but Eleanor Bennet cannot accept." Eleanor Bennet's beautiful eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. "Why?" Edward King couldn't understand why Eleanor Bennet would refuse. There was no grievance in becoming his main consort. Eleanor Bennet desires a loyal, lifelong love with only one person. For someone of the esteemed status of a prince, how could that be possible? Eleanor Bennet decided to make things clear with him, unwilling to prolong the entanglement any further. A lifelong love with only one person? Edward King looked at Eleanor Bennet, his expression incredulous. "I promise to cherish and adore you for a lifetime. I will grant you the most honorable status. Is that still not enough?" Edward King, losing control, held Eleanor Bennet tightly. What must he do to make her understand her irreplaceable position in his heart? Love is something that cannot be shared. Eleanor Bennet and your Highness may have fate but not destiny. I hope your Highness finds someone more deserving. Eleanor Bennet pushed Edward King away, her cold demeanor clearly showing her resolve. She did not expect anyone in this era of numerous concubines to understand her concept of love. Yet, she was unaware that in Edward King's heart, she had already become someone he could never let go of. Such a unique woman, if he could not have her, then no one else would. The world would eventually belong to him, and so would she. One day, she would change her mind. The carriage stopped in front of the Bennet residence, and Eleanor Bennet stepped down first. At this moment, Arthur Bennet had already received word and knew Edward King would be arriving with Eleanor Bennet. "Father." Seeing Arthur Bennet waiting outside the residence, Eleanor Bennet hurriedly stepped forward to support him. "Your servant greets His Highness, Prince Edward." Arthur Bennet, noticing Edward King stepping out of the carriage, quickly bowed in respect. "Minister Bennet, you are gravely ill, there is no need for formalities." Edward King observed Arthur Bennet coughing incessantly. Could he truly be unwell? "Your Highness, please come inside for tea." Arthur Bennet invited Edward King inside. Eleanor Bennet helped Arthur Bennet to sit down on the grand chair in the main hall, while Edward King took the seat of honor. "Minister Bennet, your grave illness has greatly concerned my father. Thus, I have come today to visit you personally. I hope you can forgive this sudden intrusion." Edward King's tone was polite, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "Father, may I go check on the medicine?" Eleanor Bennet suspected Edward King's visit was not merely to inquire about her father's health, so she tactfully excused herself. Matters of the court were best left to these seasoned politicians. She truly had no interest in such false pleasantries. Arthur Bennet nodded in approval, catching the lingering gaze of Edward King as he watched Eleanor Bennet leave. Secretly, Arthur Bennet felt delighted. Could it be that Edward King had fallen for his daughter? Eleanor Bennet left the main hall and returned to her room to write a prescription, instructing Clara Young to deliver it to the steward. Arthur Bennet had only been taking a specific concoction she prepared, which induced symptoms resembling a common cold. A simple antidote would cure him. Now that Arthur Bennet's objective had been achieved, he only needed a few days of rest at home before returning to court. Eleanor Bennet exhaled in relief and then went to the Buddhist temple to visit Lady Bennet. It wasn't until after dinner that Eleanor Bennet bid farewell to Lady Bennet and returned to her room. She thought Edward King must have already left by now. "Miss, the master requests your presence in the study," the steward reported from outside the door. "Yes, tell my father I'll come by later." Eleanor Bennet adjusted her jewelry and attire, draped on a cloak, and headed to the study. "Father, you were looking for me?" Eleanor Bennet entered the study and immediately noticed a bowl of still warm medicine placed on the table. "Eleanor, come in. It's cold outside." Arthur Bennet smiled warmly. "Father, the medicine will get cold. Please drink it right away." Eleanor Bennet picked up the bowl and handed it to Arthur Bennet. "Eleanor, you're becoming more and more filial." Arthur Bennet was overjoyed and drank the entire bowl in one go. Eleanor Bennet then offered him tea and assisted him in rinsing his mouth. "Father, after taking this medicine, you should feel better by tomorrow. In a few days, you'll be able to return to court." "Yes, it's thanks to Eleanor's strategy this time that we managed to dispel the suspicions of Prince Jing and Prince Yi." Arthur Bennet stroked his beard, his face brimming with satisfaction. "Although we've escaped this time, such situations are likely to occur more frequently in the future." Eleanor Bennet understood well that maintaining neutrality in the court was no easy feat. A single misstep could make them everyone's target. "That's exactly what worries me. Eleanor, does Prince Jing have feelings for you?" Arthur Bennet suddenly asked, catching Eleanor Bennet off guard. "Father, why would you ask that? I may have been too forward." Seeing Eleanor Bennet's expression, Arthur Bennet realized he had guessed correctly. "Father, there's nothing between me and His Highness Prince Jing. Please don't make wild assumptions." Eleanor Bennet's serious tone surprised Arthur Bennet. Could it be that Prince Jing's feelings were unrequited and Eleanor had no interest? But that didn't matter, it was enough for Arthur to know that Prince Jing had feelings for her. "Father, I have to enter the palace tomorrow. I'll return to my room now." Eleanor Bennet glanced at Arthur Bennet, whose face showed a hint of smugness, suspecting he was likely plotting something again. The next day, upon returning to the Imperial Medical Institute, Eleanor Bennet found her room filled with blooming plum branches. She was astonished. Who would dare to be so bold as to break off freshly bloomed branches from the Imperial Gardens and bring them here? "Master Bennet, you've returned to the palace." At that moment, Xiao Lingzi from the Imperial Pharmacy happened to pass by and quickly bowed upon seeing Eleanor Bennet. "Xiao Lingzi, who brought these plum branches to my room?" Eleanor Bennet's eyes flashed with anger. To break branches in the Imperial Gardens without permission was truly audacious. "Master Bennet, this morning eunuch Shui from the Palace of Scenic Blossoms sent them over." Xiao Lingzi looked at Eleanor Bennet, who was usually gentle but now visibly furious, and couldn't help but feel a little scared. Don't women generally love flowers? Could Master Bennet be an exception? Palace of Scenic Blossoms. Eleanor Bennet immediately thought this must be an order from Edward King. The servants wouldn't dare to act so boldly. It seemed her cold refusal yesterday was completely misunderstood by Edward King. "Xiao Lingzi, take these flowers to the backyard and burn them." Eleanor Bennet tidied up her medicine chest and headed towards the Hall of Heavenly Purity, leaving Xiao Lingzi bewildered, thinking that the young lady of the Bennet family was indeed a unique case. Today, she wasn't in the mood to pay attention to these flowers. She had to visit the Hall of Morning Flowers to check Charles King's pulse, fearing it would be another difficult encounter. Chapter 22, Hall of Morning Flowers. As Eleanor Bennet entered the Hall of Heavenly Purity, she saw Alexander King writing, with the beautiful concubine Florence beside him grinding ink, a scene of perfect harmony. Eleanor Bennet hurriedly paid her respects. "Eleanor Bennet has arrived." Alexander King put down his brush and sat on the couch. Concubine Florence quickly stepped forward to offer tea. "His Majesty's health has completely recovered," Eleanor Bennet reported respectfully after checking the pulse. "Yes, thanks to Eleanor Bennet's efforts." Alexander King was extremely pleased. "Your Majesty, I am relieved to see your health restored," Concubine Florence said coyly, leaning against Alexander King. "Eleanor Bennet, you are in charge of caring for Charles. If you need anything, just inform the Imperial Household Department, and I will order them to fully cooperate. From now on, you don't need to come to the Hall of Heavenly Purity for daily checkups." Eleanor Bennet accepted the order and withdrew. Recalling Concubine Florence's demeanor, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel uneasy. Encountering her repeatedly these days was truly unbearable. Eleanor Bennet arrived in front of the Hall of Morning Flowers but saw no one. She was puzzled, why wasn't there even a single attendant? Given Charles King's level of favor, the place should be bustling with servants. Eleanor Bennet slowly entered the inner hall, hoping to find someone serving there. However, the vast hall was empty. If not for the lavish and clean furnishings, Eleanor Bennet would have thought she had entered a cold palace. Eleanor Bennet carefully observed the Hall of Morning Flowers. The red sandalwood furniture was gilded, the palace lamps intricately carved, and the watercolored silk draped gracefully between tall columns, revealing a large bed. In the center of the hall was a red sandalwood platform, with a rosewood table in front. Beside the table were two copper braziers, emitting a comfortable warmth. On either side of the platform were two sandalwood beds, each with a small rosewood table in front. On the table to the right was a white jade sword stand, holding a precious sword. Eleanor Bennet curiously approached, examining the jewel-encrusted scabbard, with two golden dragons twisting vividly. It was clearly a treasured sword. Observing these luxurious items, each a rare treasure, it was evident that Alexander King doted on his son immensely. Do you know that entering the Hall of Morning Flowers without permission is punishable by death? Eleanor Bennet turned to see Charles King standing at the door, his expression grim. I didn't want to barge in either, but your palace is even lonelier than the cold palace, not a single soul in sight. Eleanor Bennet muttered resentfully. Truly like a ghost, entering without a sound. Charles King sat lazily on the main couch, leaning against soft cushions, covered with a fur blanket. At that moment, a servant brought in tea and quickly retreated. Charles King sipped his tea, seemingly treating Eleanor Bennet as if she didn't exist. The prince seems to be feeling better today. I shall take my leave, Eleanor Bennet said, unwilling to linger around him, preparing to leave. It seems I haven't given you permission to leave yet. Charles King's cold black eyes gleamed with a hint of cunning. What exactly do you want, your highness? Eleanor Bennet couldn't fathom his intentions. Come here. Charles King gestured for Eleanor Bennet to approach him. Eleanor Bennet hesitated, wondering what he was planning now. Are you planning to diagnose me from over there? Charles King sneered coldly as he watched her reluctance to come closer. Left with no choice, Eleanor Bennet moved closer, sitting on the bed to check his pulse. His pulse was similar to the last time at the hot springs, yet she still couldn't find any clues. May I ask you a few questions? Eleanor Bennet was entirely clueless about the cold energy emanating from him. If it truly was a cold poison, how had he been afflicted by it? No. Charles King rejected her coldly. Then how am I supposed to diagnose you? Eleanor Bennet suppressed her anger as she replied. Woman, with that attitude of yours toward me, it's enough to warrant execution. Charles King's icy gaze seemed to pierce through her. Anyone can find a reason to punish someone if they wish. Eleanor Bennet stepped back slightly in fear. Breaking into the Hall of Morning Flowers without permission, disregarding my authority, don't you think that's enough? Charles King advanced step by step, trapping Eleanor Bennet in his arms. Charles King. Let me go. Eleanor Bennet struggled to break free, but he held her tightly against his chest. Woman, you're becoming more audacious, daring to call me by my name. Charles King's cold fingers traced along Eleanor Bennet's delicate face, slowly sliding down to her plump cherry lips, evoking an urge to bite. Eleanor Bennet turned her head to avoid his warm breath. I should punish you a little, or you'll forget who your master is. Charles King kissed Eleanor Bennet's lips, causing her eyes to widen in shock. Her breathing grew rapid. Charles King savored the sweetness he had missed for so long, addicted to her taste. Woman, remember to breathe next time. Charles King smirked devilishly as he released the blushing Eleanor Bennet. Charles King, you, Eleanor Bennet stammered in embarrassment, unable to form a coherent sentence. Why did she always end up being taken advantage of by this scoundrel? Charles King, what exactly do you want? If you want my life, just take it. Eleanor Bennet pulled out her hairpin, aiming it directly at her own neck. Charles King was quicker, stopping her before she could act. Without my permission, woman, you have no right to die. Charles King held his injured hand, blood dripping through his fingers. Eleanor Bennet had only wanted to take a gamble, not expecting Charles King to get hurt. He clearly didn't want her life, so what did he want? Haven't you always wanted my life? Why save me? Eleanor Bennet took a clean cloth from the medicine box, carefully bandaging Charles King's wound. I didn't save you. You still have value to me. Eleanor Bennet ignored him, focusing on treating the wound. Shouldn't you tell me where the cold poison in your body came from? Otherwise, I really can't treat it. Today, Eleanor Bennet realized that Charles King was only cold on the outside. This was related to his upbringing. In modern terms, he was just a high school student. Thinking of this, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but smile. As for her, she was practically a spinster. What are you smiling at? Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet, who seemed secretly pleased, and couldn't help but be curious. She didn't seem afraid of him at all. In this palace, people either respected, hated, or feared him. Only she dared to defy him, dared to challenge his limits. He increasingly found the woman in front of him intriguing, exuding a frankness without any pretense. She even made him lower his guard, marveling at how unique she was. Eleanor Bennet caught a fleeting smile on his usually cold face, surprised as she looked at him. Have you looked enough, woman? Is there a flower on my face? Eleanor Bennet realized her rudeness and quickly looked down. Actually, your smile is more beautiful than a flower. Eleanor Bennet's whispered comment reached Charles King's ears. Can you answer my earlier question? Eleanor Bennet was genuinely curious about him, wanting to know more. I was poisoned with a curse. Charles King maintained his cold demeanor, but when mentioning the curse, a murderous glint appeared in his eyes. A curse? Eleanor Bennet couldn't believe what she heard. As a renowned medical doctor, she felt stumped. This was beyond her imagination. Why are you reacting so strongly? Charles King felt completely baffled. I'm afraid I really can't cure your condition. Eleanor Bennet faced a truly difficult problem this time. I never had any hope of being cured. The hint of sadness in Charles King's eyes tugged at Eleanor Bennet's heart. She had sensed this sorrow from him more than once. There is no knot in this world that cannot be untied. Even if I can't completely cure your illness, I'll do my best to ease your pain. Eleanor Bennet's eyes shone with sincere determination, and her comforting words warmed Charles King's heart. For the first time in years, he felt this warmth, and it came from a stranger. Eleanor Bennet suddenly realized how lonely he was. What good was living in luxury and power? My lord, Dr. Moore requests an audience. At this moment, a servant announced from outside the chamber. Let him in. Charles King resumed his cold, arrogant demeanor, reclining on the bed. Eleanor Bennet did not expect to meet Daniel Moore in the palace again. Surely, he would be even more surprised. Eleanor Bennet looked at the man in white entering the room, a cheerful smile appearing on her face. You don't look too bad. Daniel Moore remarked, glancing at Charles King lying on the bed, not yet noticing Eleanor Bennet's surprise beside him. Were he and Charles King that familiar with each other? There seemed to be no formalities between them. Why, do you need me to be in unbearable pain for you to be happy? Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet, who was overly delighted beside him, feeling a bit tense. Could she and Daniel Moore know each other? Eleanor Bennet. Is that you? Daniel Moore suddenly noticed Eleanor Bennet smiling at him, unable to hide his joy. Daniel Moore, long time no see. Eleanor Bennet beamed like a blossoming peach, reminiscent of a spring breeze. Daniel Moore was somewhat excited, not expecting to meet her again. Why are you in the palace? Daniel Moore asked, surprised to find the person he always missed had entered the palace. It's a long story. Eleanor Bennet knew she shouldn't have hidden her identity that day. Do you two know each other? Charles King asked, visibly displeased, seeing Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore's familiarity. A sense of jealousy surged within him. Charles, she is the woman with the extraordinary medical skills I told you about. Daniel Moore exclaimed, still cheerful, oblivious to Charles King's darkening mood. Charles King vividly remembered the affection in Daniel Moore's eyes when he spoke of her. He hadn't expected that person to be Eleanor Bennet. Suddenly, he felt as if his treasure had been stolen. Lady Bennet, please leave for now. Come back tomorrow to check my pulse. Charles King ordered, dismissing her. Eleanor Bennet quickly left, noticing his increasingly gloomy face. Before leaving, she playfully winked at Daniel Moore. This smile did not escape Charles King's cold gaze. How is Master doing? Charles King asked with a hint of anger. Daniel Moore immediately sensed his annoyance. But why was he angry? Could it be because of Eleanor Bennet? Master is well, just busy researching the soul silkworm poison. Daniel Moore understood his proud junior too well. The way Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet carried an inscrutable depth. Could he have developed feelings? Daniel Moore certainly hoped not. With Charles King's personality, Eleanor Bennet would undoubtedly get hurt. He didn't want her to suffer any harm. The two sat in silence, each drinking their own tea. But in their hearts, they both thought of the beautiful woman who had just left. Her smile and gaze were etched deeply in their hearts, like the bright moon, unable to hide its radiant glow. Chapter 23, Conversations Under the Moonlight. Daniel Moore sat in the Hall of Morning Flowers for a while before taking his leave. It had been a long time since he last saw Eleanor Bennet, and he hadn't expected to meet her in the palace. What surprised him even more was that she had become the chief female official of Bryn. With many questions and emotions swirling inside him, Daniel Moore headed to the Imperial Medical Institute. Dr. Moore has entered the palace today. A eunuch greeted Daniel Moore warmly upon seeing him. Yes, thank you. May I ask if Lord Bennet is here? Daniel Moore responded politely. Lord Bennet should be in the hall. I have other duties to attend to, please excuse me. The eunuch smiled and withdrew. Daniel Moore entered the hall and saw Eleanor Bennet sitting at a table, seemingly engrossed in some study or research. Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore called softly. Daniel. Come in and sit. Eleanor Bennet's face lit up with joy upon seeing him. Eleanor Bennet, I didn't expect to find you in the palace. Daniel Moore recalled his previous speculations, and the reality brought him a sense of relief. Daniel, I didn't mean to hide it from you, it's just, Eleanor Bennet hesitated. Eleanor Bennet, you don't need to explain, I understand. Daniel Moore knew she must have had her reasons back then. Just seeing her again was enough for him. Daniel, it's been so long since we last met. Why don't you stay in the palace tonight? Eleanor Bennet thought to herself how rare it was to find a true confidant. This was enough for a lifetime. All right. Daniel Moore agreed readily. What he admired most about Eleanor Bennet was her straightforwardness and sincerity. It was what set her apart from other women. You should rest for now. I'll come find you for dinner later. Eleanor Bennet smiled softly and left the hall. Eunuch Lin, Dr. Moore will be staying in the palace tonight. Please prepare a room, Eleanor Bennet instructed Xiao Lindsay, the young eunuch standing outside. Yes, Lord Bennet. Dr. Moore, please follow me, Xiao Lindsay replied respectfully, then led Daniel Moore away. Before leaving, Daniel Moore gave Eleanor Bennet a warm smile. Eleanor Bennet spent her time at the Imperial Pharmacy inspecting the medicinal supplies for the various palaces. It was only when the lanterns were lit that her work was done. The chilly breeze of the night made it the perfect weather for hot pot. She wrote a list, handed Xiao Lindsay a silver ingot, and asked him to make the preparations. Afterward, Eleanor Bennet returned to her room, changed out of her official attire, donned a light blue cloak, and headed to Daniel Moore's quarters. Daniel Moore was waiting for her in his room. When he saw that Eleanor Bennet had changed out of her formal robes, his eyes lit up. "Daniel!" Eleanor Bennet greeted him with a radiant smile. "Eleanor Bennet." Daniel Moore froze, his face turning a deep shade of red. "So men can feel shy too." Eleanor Bennet chuckled softly as she stepped into the room. "Daniel, it seems you're quite close. With that cold-faced guy, huh?" Eleanor Bennet sipped her tea and asked. "Cold-faced?" Daniel Moore looked surprised. "Charles King. Oh. He's my junior disciple." Daniel Moore thought to himself that the nickname Eleanor Bennet gave Charles King was indeed fitting. Junior disciple. Eleanor Bennet widened her eyes in astonishment. "So, the two of you must have some mysterious, highly skilled master, who's also a quirky old man, right?" Eleanor Bennet, imagining scenes from martial arts dramas, couldn't help but laugh. "Eleanor Bennet, how do you know that?" Daniel Moore looked at Eleanor Bennet, who was laughing uncontrollably. She was right, his master's temperament was truly eccentric. "I just guessed." Thinking about the things she had experienced, which were even more bizarre than martial arts dramas, Eleanor Bennet sighed deeply. "Eleanor Bennet, what's wrong?" Daniel Moore noticed her sudden melancholy and felt puzzled. "Then you must know about the cold poison in him, right?" Mentioning Charles King always brought an overwhelming sadness to Eleanor Bennet. "He has the soul silkworm poison from the western reaches snow mountains. Those afflicted with this poison endure a lifetime of icy erosion and unbearable pain. Is there really no way to cure it? Our master has tried countless methods over the years, but none have worked." Daniel Moore sighed helplessly. Hearing this, Eleanor Bennet felt the air grow heavier, her thoughts clouded by doubts about the deaths of concubine Violet and the Empress, which only deepened her unease. "Lady Bennet, servant Xiao Lindsay greets you." Eleanor Bennet stepped outside and saw several eunuchs waiting nearby. "Xiao Lindsay, just place it on the stone table in the pavilion." Eleanor Bennet glanced at the items she had requested and was pleased. Xiao Lindsay followed her instructions, setting the brass pot with burning charcoal, food, and warm wine on the table. "Lady Bennet, everything is ready." Xiao Lindsay seemed curious about what Eleanor Bennet intended to do. "Xiao Lindsay, you've worked hard. Take this and have some drinks with the others." Eleanor Bennet handed him a silver ingot as a reward. "Thank you, Lady Bennet." Xiao Lindsay happily accepted it and left. Eleanor Bennet eagerly stepped into the pavilion, looking at the spread on the stone table. Everything was perfectly prepared. "Daniel, come over and eat." Eleanor Bennet called out to Daniel Moore, who approached with a curious expression. "Eleanor Bennet, what is this?" Daniel Moore stared at the bubbling broth in the brass pot, along with the raw meat and fresh vegetables, intrigued. "Hot pot." Eleanor Bennet finished mixing the dipping sauce and tossed a few slices of meat into the pot. "Hot pot?" It was Daniel Moore's first time seeing such an unusual way of dining. "This weather is perfect for hot pot and some wine." Eleanor Bennet eagerly grabbed a piece of just cooked meat and popped it into her mouth, her face full of satisfaction. "Daniel, you must try this, it's delicious." Eleanor Bennet picked up a piece and offered it to Daniel Moore. This moment filled her with happiness. Daniel Moore tasted it and indeed, it was delectable. "Help yourself." Eleanor Bennet's cheeks flushed as she smiled radiantly, like the morning sun. The two raised their cups, drinking and chatting cheerfully, completely unaffected by the cold winter night. Daniel Moore found Eleanor Bennet even more captivating tonight. He had seen her gentle and lovable side, her intelligent and sharp demeanor, but her lively and carefree charm this evening mesmerized him further. Her bright smile was etched deeply into his heart, and he knew he wished to be lost in her forever. Eleanor Bennet was especially excited tonight. It was the most relaxing evening she'd had since arriving in this unfamiliar world. After a few more drinks, she began to feel dizzy, her consciousness turning hazy. Daniel Moore gazed at Eleanor Bennet's flushed face, his eyes filled with affection. "Eleanor Bennet, you're drunk. Let me help you back." "I'm not Eleanor Bennet. My name is Eleanor Bennet." At this point, her consciousness was so blurred, it seemed as though she was returning to her own world. "Eleanor Bennet, let me take you back." Daniel Moore was momentarily shaken by her drunken words. Who was Eleanor Bennet? How could she get this drunk? A cold voice interrupted Daniel Moore's thoughts. Charles King stood outside the pavilion, his gaze filled with anger. "What are you doing here?" Daniel Moore was startled to see Charles King appear at this moment. "Knowing you were staying in the palace tonight, I came to check." Charles King stepped forward and scooped up the unconscious Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore stood aside, but he understood clearly, Charles King was here because of her.